I've noticed something pretty interesting after watching how people react to money. Not when they're broke, but when they first see a relatively large amount of money sitting in their account. Maybe one day they open their banking app and see a number that makes them pause for a few seconds. Maybe it's a few $1,000s, maybe it's tens of thousands, or maybe it's an even bigger milestone. What's interesting is that the emotion in that moment is rarely pride. Instead, a lot of people suddenly feel confused. They're not quite sure what they should do next. Before that, things were much simpler. When money was tight, there weren't that many decisions to make. Money came into the account, and then it went back out. But when money starts accumulating into a noticeable amount, the brain begins asking completely different questions. What if I invest it wrong? What if I spend it on the wrong thing? What if I mess up the money that took me years to save? I've seen this moment happen to a lot of people, and what's interesting is this. Many people believe having more money will make life easier, but in reality, at certain stages, having money can actually force you to face much harder decisions, not because money is dangerous, but because the way we think about money changes once the numbers start getting bigger. In this video, I want to share a few things I've noticed after years of watching how people handle their first real financial milestones. Not rigid rules, but subtle psychological shifts. Shifts that, if you understand them, can help you avoid mistakes that cost other people years of financial progress. And the interesting thing is, most people don't struggle financially because they lack money. They struggle because they misunderstand the role of the money they already have. Main point 1. The moment money starts changing roles, I've noticed something a little unusual when watching how people build savings in the early years of their lives. At first, money has a very clear job. Its job is to keep you out of trouble. You need money to pay rent, to pay your electricity bill, to buy food, and to deal with unexpected things life throws at you. At that stage, money works like a cushion. It makes life feel a little less fragile. But at some point, when the amount of money begins to grow, something quiet starts to happen. The role of money begins to change. It's no longer just something that protects you from risk. It starts becoming a tool that can shape your future. What's interesting is that many people don't recognize this transition. They continue treating their money the same way they always have. They keep it in familiar places. They don't want to touch it. They feel comfortable just seeing the number sit there. And on the surface, that sounds responsible. But in many cases, it isn't caution. It's hesitation disguised as safety. I've met people who managed to build a pretty solid savings balance, but years later, that number barely moved. Not because they spent it all, but because they never allowed their money to do any work. Most people think the biggest financial risk is losing money. But there's another risk that gets talked about far less, and that's letting time pass while your money stays still. Because money has a very interesting characteristic. When it's placed in the right environment, it can start producing more money. And when that happens year after year, the difference eventually becomes enormous. What's fascinating is that people who build long-term wealth rarely do anything overly complicated. They simply understand one thing earlier than most people. At some point, money shouldn't just be protected. It needs to be assigned a new job. Not all of it, but at least part of it. And once that shift begins, the way you think about money changes completely. You're no longer only thinking about protecting money. You begin thinking about how money moves through time. And that's when the financial game becomes far more interesting. Main point 2. Sometimes feeling safe is what keeps money stuck. After watching how people manage their finances for a while, I started noticing a very common reaction. When someone first builds a meaningful amount of savings, they often feel a very strong instinct. The instinct to hold on to it tightly. And that reaction makes complete sense. Because most of us are used to earning money through effort. We work long hours. We save little by little. We cut back on things we want. So when the money finally adds up into something substantial, the brain sends a very natural message. Don't do anything that could make this disappear. The interesting thing is that this feeling isn't completely wrong. Part of your money does need to stay safe, But the problem begins when safety becomes the only goal. I've seen many people leave their savings untouched for years simply because they're afraid of making the wrong decision. Every time they think about doing something with their money, the same questions appear. What if I pick the wrong investment? What if the market changes? What if I lose part of what I worked so hard to build? And eventually, they choose the easiest option. They do nothing. At first glance, that seems very safe. But there's something most people overlook. When money stays still for too long, life keeps moving. Living costs rise. Investment opportunities appear and disappear. Time quietly passes. And in finance, time is often more important than the perfect decision. I've met people who didn't know very much about investing, but they started early and stayed consistent. And over the years, their money grew in a surprisingly steady way. On the other hand, I've also met people who spent years researching. They read books. They watched videos. They studied every strategy they could find, but they always felt like they weren't quite ready yet. And in the end, the only thing they truly lost was time. What's interesting is that people who build lasting wealth rarely wait for perfect confidence. They simply start with a plan that's simple enough to begin. Then they let time do most of the work. Not because they're reckless, but because they understand something very basic. In many situations, standing still for too long is also a form of risk. Main point 3. A very common mistake. When money starts adding up. After years of watching how people handle their finances, I've noticed something pretty interesting. When the amount of money in our accounts is still small, we tend to be very careful. We think before buying something. We consider things before signing up for a service. We even remember pretty clearly where our money is going. But once the number in the account starts getting a little bigger, a quiet psychological shift begins to happen. The brain starts feeling like things are finally okay. Not because life has completely changed, but because simply having a cushion of money in the account creates a very comforting feeling. Almost like having something soft behind your back. What's interesting is that this feeling can make us slightly less alert, not through big decisions, but through very small ones. A new subscription, a slightly more convenient product, a more expensive option because I deserve it. Each individual decision seems reasonable on its own. But when people look back a few years later, many realize their lifestyle has changed more than they expected, not through one big leap, but through dozens of tiny steps. And the interesting part is that this doesn't just happen to people who spend freely. It also happens to very disciplined people, because when life becomes more stable, the brain naturally starts trying to raise the standard of living just a little. What most people don't notice is this. One of the biggest factors that determines how fast you build wealth isn't how much you earn. It's how quickly your lifestyle rises when your income goes up. I've met people whose income increased steadily over time, yet they always felt like they were never truly ahead. Not because they were bad with money, but because every time their life improved a little, their expenses quietly moved up too. And as a result, the space for long-term savings never really expanded. People who build lasting wealth tend to have a very simple habit. When their income increases, they don't upgrade their entire lifestyle all at once. They upgrade a portion of it, and they keep the rest for longer-term plans, not because they live miserably, but because they understand something very practical. Money can bring a lot of comfort into your life. But if every form of comfort increases at the same time, money never gets the chance to accumulate long enough to create real change. Main point 4. As money grows, the hardest skill isn't earning, it's patience. After observing the financial behavior of many people, I noticed something quite interesting. When the amount of savings is still small, progress is easy to see. You save a little more, and the number in the account clearly changes. You feel like you're moving forward, but when the amount of money starts getting bigger, that feeling slowly fades. You're still saving consistently, you're still working hard, but every time you add a small amount, the total barely seems to move. This creates a strange psychological effect. The brain starts thinking you're not progressing as fast as before, and that's when many people begin looking for something more exciting. A special investment opportunity, a faster way to make money, a decision that feels smarter than what they've been doing. I've seen this happen many times, not because people are greedy, but because they start feeling bored with stability. The interesting thing is that personal finance rarely rewards excitement. It usually rewards consistency repeated over a long period of time. Many people who build large amounts of wealth didn't do it because they constantly made brilliant decisions. They did it because they avoided the decisions that reset everything back to zero. What most people don't notice is this. In long-term financial journeys, the biggest mistakes rarely come from ordinary decisions. They usually come from decisions made during moments of overconfidence or frustration, an investment that's far too risky, a large purchase that never would have crossed your mind before, or a sudden change simply because you want to feel like you're doing something new. People who maintain steady financial progress tend to share one important trait. They understand that certain phases of finance will feel boring. No big leaps, no huge wins, just small steps repeated over many years. And those seemingly boring years are often when money begins working most effectively, quietly, without attention, but consistently enough to create major change over time. Main point 5. The biggest change isn't the amount of money, it's how you think about it. After years of observing how people build their finances, I've noticed something very interesting. The most important moment in someone's financial journey usually isn't when they earn a large amount of money. It happens earlier than that. It's when they begin seeing money, not just as a number, but as a system. Most people initially think personal finance is a series of separate decisions. How much to save today? What to invest in this month? Whether or not to buy something. But when I look at people who build stable wealth over many years, I notice they do something different. They design a simple system, and then they let that system run. Income increases. Part of the money is automatically saved. Part of it gets invested consistently. Life continues as usual, but the financial plan keeps running quietly in the background. What's interesting is that when a simple system is maintained long enough, the results are often far greater than occasional smart decisions. Most people don't fail because they lack knowledge. They fail because every financial decision depends on willpower in the moment. And willpower is an unstable resource. Some days you're disciplined. Other days you're tired, stressed, or simply don't want to think about money. People who go far financially don't try to be perfect. They simply make their system as easy to maintain as possible. And after many years, they look back and realize something very simple. Money didn't grow because of one brilliant decision. It grew because many small decisions were repeated long enough. That's why when someone first builds a meaningful amount of savings, the most important step isn't finding the perfect next move. It's creating a structure you can maintain for many years. Not overly complicated, not stressful, but stable enough to keep moving forward. And the interesting thing is that when that system runs long enough, one day you look back and realize the numbers have changed far more than you expected. Not because you did anything extraordinary, but because you didn't stop halfway. If you found these ideas helpful, hit like so this video can reach more people. And if you're interested in how people think about money and how small habits create big differences over time, consider subscribing to the channel. I'll keep sharing real observations about money psychology and financial behavior that many people overlook. I'll see you in the next video.